Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting. We're going to begin here, as we generally do, with our large square-headed brush. It is slightly damp. We are working in the sky, and I'm predominantly using a lot of titanium white and a little bit of primary blue as well. Then I'm going back to my palette and grabbing some gray. This is a mixture of a lot of titanium white and a very small amount of Mars black. I'm applying it over our blue. The two are mixing and blending, which is actually a fantastic thing because it looks like the sky's color is reflecting upon the mountain, and this is generally the case for things in the far distance. So we're already establishing a little bit of depth. From there, I'm taking an old square-headed brush, one where the bristles kind of leaf off in varying directions, so when you make a dabbing motion with it, you render a litany of different implications. So I'm applying this green here at the back of the painting, and a lot of it is blending with the gray, which is desaturating it. This is actually fantastic because you generally want the background of your painting to be more desaturated. You want to save the more saturated colors for your foreground, and it'll really create a lot of depth easily. So that's what we're doing, and as I move closer to us in this line of trees, I'm using a little bit more of a saturated pigment and I'm darkening it just a little bit as well. But as you can see with that dabbing motion, we rendered just a myriad of different little trees there. And it's great because they aren't too detailed, but you still get the general idea and shape of them. From there, I'm going to switch over to that same large square-headed brush that we used for the sky, and I'm going to begin working in some water. So there, as you could see, I went over the base of our green and I kind of blended a little bit of it downwards. I did that so we got a bit of a reflection, and it just adds a little bit of a detail to the painting. It's not as stark, it's not as green, it's not as textured as the trees themselves, but you still get that implication of them. And so much of painting, especially small painting, is about implication. So just giving the eye enough so that it thinks, yeah, that's what that is. In the foreground, you can be much more detailed, but if you incorporate all of that detail in the background, you lose a lot of depth. So you want to introduce it slowly as you move up in the painting. So with that being said, I'm now working on the middle ground of the painting. And I'm using a green. The green is a bit more saturated this time, and it's a bit darker as well. That's because in the background you want to use much less saturated colors, but you also want to use less stark valued colors. So as you move forward in the painting, we use a lot more of a black in our mixture. So here what we're using is a mixture of primary yellow, primary blue, some Mars black, and a tiny bit of titanium white as well. But as we move closer to us in the painting, we'll incorporate more Mars black, just to ensure that it gets a little bit darker, and that way when we add on our highlights, you'll get this very nice stark contrast. It is worth noting that at this point in the painting, nothing is done. The trees are not done, the background is not done, the mountain's not done, the water isn't done. We're putting down a base and a foundation right now, and it's wildly necessary. It's like building a house. While the foundation of it isn't highly aesthetically pleasing, it is 100% necessary to build on top of, and that's what we're doing right here. We haven't incorporated any detail, and we haven't really incorporated any nice stark saturated colors, but they will be coming very soon, and they'll look so much better because we have this great base and background. So from there, I'm throwing in some reflections, just like we did in the back of the painting, to our middle ground, and I'm just using a lot of water to do that. That will make our paint much more transparent, and you get a nicer mix between the blue and the green. It doesn't look as stark, it doesn't look as detailed, and it's just a much more natural aesthetic. So when you're working in the reflections, I would highly implore you to use a good amount of water. From there, I'm switching over to my medium-sized square-headed brush, and I'm beginning to work in the base layer for our bridge, our dock, whatever you'd like to call it here. We're working in a very dark base layer, and then we'll add the highlights, the lighter colors on top of it. But here, we're just building it in. So I'm using a square-headed brush here because I know I want the edges of this to be very sharp. And a square-headed brush is fantastic for that because it innately has very sharp edges. If we were to use a liner brush or a small round-headed brush, it has a bit of a feathered edge and it wouldn't look as sharp. So whenever you want to render something very hard, something with a very distinct line, use a square-headed brush, use the edge of it, and you'll get something that works fantastic. Here I'm using it again to render the trees in the middle ground, and we'll also use it to render the trees in the foreground as well. Now, I think this is a great point in this spring painting to remind you that the painting isn't always going to look fantastic. You need to go through stages. Right now, it looks like kind of a mess, but it's supposed to look like a mess. So if you're at this point in the painting or any of your paintings and you're like, it's not done, but I don't like it, keep painting, keep finishing it, because a lot of the time it's meant to look kind of rough at a certain stage. Again, we're just building a foundation. We are building it up, and we don't have the opportunity to make it look really pretty, really aesthetically pleasing until we have this base layer finished. So back into the technique itself, here you can see that I've rendered two trees in the foreground, and they're very different from one another. You want to ensure that you're always incorporating a lot of diversity, that you're changing things. Trees, nature, it wasn't man-made. So you don't ever want two clouds to look the same, you don't ever want two mountains to look the same, you don't ever want two clusters of foliage or trees to look the same. You want it to always be evolving and ensure that it's interesting. So that's really what we're doing there. As we move up the trees, I'm branching it off, I'm moving into different directions, and our strokes, our application is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And you can generally do that by using a lighter touch of the brush. From there, I'm going to use that same brush, grab a lighter mixture of our brown. I'm specifically using a burnt umber, a bit of titanium white, and a tiny bit of Mars black. All of the paints that we use in this tutorial will be listed in the description, as well as the brushes. So here I'm applying different boards to our dock here, and you'll notice that it already looks like it's coming together very quickly. And that's because, for the most part, I'm just using my brush, the edge of it, that same size, to render these. It's such a quick, efficient method of rendering boards. These very clean, sharp strokes with the square-headed brush. I'm leaving little dark areas in between each board because that's the area where there's a separation. There's more shadows in there, the light can't get in there. So we're just ensuring that we're breaking it up and we're adding that detail to the foreground. We mentioned that we didn't want too much of it in the background because we didn't want to kind of destroy the depth in the painting. But in the foreground, this is where you really get to dive into that. You really get to have fun with the detail, and you aren't working entirely through impressions. So that's what I'm doing. Then I'm going in and I'm incorporating the little pieces that are holding this dock up. They sink into the water, and they just add that little extra piece of detail and realism that helps the painting. From there, I'm taking my smaller square-headed brush, adding some detail just a little bit into the mountains. Then I'm separating our land from our water, and I'm not using a pure titanium white, it's more of a grade green, and it's very watered down. I did this because I didn't want it to be stark, I wanted it to be fairly transparent, and that's exactly what it is. We don't want it to take away from anything. We don't want it to be too distracting, which is why we aren't using a pure white. Then I'm taking my old square-headed brush, and I began to work in some foliage at the tops of our trees. I tried to ensure that the value matched the bottom of that portion, the bushes, the foliage, and all of that. But I had to wait for the majority of those trees to dry before I did that. Otherwise, the colors could get a little bit messy and begin to blend together. Now, it's worth noting that right now in this 10-minute version, I'm showing you the spring version. There isn't too much foliage, there aren't too many highlights because spring things aren't really fully grown. The light really isn't out yet. But I will show you a sped up version of how you can turn this into a summer painting very soon as well. With that said, I'm just adding some highlights to the edges of our trees. I'm using a mixture of burnt umber and titanium white, and I'm doing a lot of it in a bit of a tapping motion. Now, there we have it at the 10-minute mark, but I do want to show you how to turn this into more of a summer painting. So I do cheat here, I do take an extra 5 minutes, but I had a lot of additional ideas that I wanted to share with you, and I thought you'd like to see them as well. So here I'm adding some additional highlights to our trees and to our dock area with my smaller square-headed brush. I'm doing this because in the summer there will be a lot more light, our highlights will be much more prominent, and things won't be too grayed down. Then I took the old square-headed brush and I took a more highlighted saturated green and I added that in as well. I did that to the foreground and to the middle ground. I didn't do it in the background, but again, it's the same idea. There is more sun out and it's just going to make everything a bit brighter and more captivating, a little more saturated as well. Then I'm throwing some additional foliage into our trees here in the foreground. I didn't have it initially because in spring, not all of the trees have foliage yet and it's not very full, but I wanted to show you what it would look like if it were incredibly full as well. So that's just what we did there. Then we added some additional reflections into the water with a very watered down mixture for both the dock and the foliage as well. Now, there is our final 10 to 15-ish minute painting. I truly hope you feel like you've learned something here today. If you'd like to learn more, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. If you'd like hour-long lessons, I also offer those on my Patreon. Again, link in the description. I post these videos every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, above all, stay creative. Oh, and by the way, I do intend on doing a Q&A in the very near future. So, if you have any questions, leave them down in the comment thread, and I'd be more than happy to attend to a couple of them. So, I'd also like to say a big, a massive, a true thank you to our Patreon producers. I'm doing a lot right now. I'm going through the process of moving, updating the studio, doing a bunch of different things. And I was looking at it and literally none of this would be possible without you, without your support. So thank you for helping this channel grow. Thank you for helping me grow. Thank you for supporting art in general. So again, as always, stay creative and pick up the brush.